Hello, and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. You've probably noticed that I'm not Paul Johnson. Paul's away this week, but there's still plenty for us to talk about. In last week's episodes, we looked at the Labour, Conservative, and Liberal Democrat manifestos. Today, we'll look at two manifestos that offer two very different visions for the country: Reform's manifesto and the Green Party's manifesto. We'll explain how their policies are different, whether their proposals can tackle the issues facing the UK, and whether they make economic sense. To do that, I'm joined by Carl Emerson and Helen Miller, colleagues of mine at the IFS. Let's start then with the most recent news. On Monday, we saw the release of the Reform Party's manifesto. Big picture here are some really big numbers and a radical shift in the scale of the state. £90 billion a year of tax cuts, £50 billion a year of spending increases, £150 billion a year in reductions on public services, debt interest, and working age benefits, and overall a state that taxes a lot less and spends a lot less at the end of the day. Carl, those sound like pretty big numbers. Can you put them in context?
They certainly are very large. I think it's important to remember that if you did cut taxes by £90 billion a year, we'd certainly describe that as a very big tax-cutting government. I think we'd also point out that tax as a share of GDP would probably be put back to what it was in 2019-20. So it's not taking the size of the state back to something that we haven't seen for a very long while. It's big. It certainly would be big. But in that sense, you wouldn't think it would be unachievable. Clearly, it does require something else to give, as well as those tax cuts. They want to increase spending in some areas of government, and they claim they can pay for it through a really big cut to public service spending, a big cut to spending on debt interest, and a big cut to working age benefits. And I think there are question marks, well, there's more than question marks about whether you can really find that money as painlessly as they suggest.
So let's take that £150 billion a year of public services, debt interest, and working age benefits. What would that actually mean in the context of current spending on those things?
Well, it would be a huge cut, and it's not the kind of cut that you can make without really cutting back on what the state is actually doing. So one of the biggest cuts the Reform want to make is what they claim is just to reduce government spending by 5% across the board. That would save you $50 billion a year. That maths is correct. But they claim that they can just find that by cutting down on waste and inefficiencies within the public sector. Now, obviously, if you set budgets $50 billion lower, you may well get $50 billion less spending. But I think what you'd actually also find is that public services wouldn't manage to do that purely by cutting back on waste and inefficiencies. There may well be some inefficiencies there, but we know that we spent the whole of the 2010s cutting budgets, trying to cut out waste wherever possible, trying to cut out low-value programs wherever possible. And we've seen the quality of public services in many areas deteriorate, which I think means that, cutting out more waste and inefficiency, not a very credible strategy, not one that you should bank on getting. That's not to say you shouldn't look for it, but you try and take out 5% across the board, you're going to end up with less good public services. I think that's clear. And I think it's important to remember also in practice, if you say we're going to take 5% out of public spending, as soon as you're in government, what you probably start doing is saying, oh, but we'll protect the NHS. Oh, we'll protect the defence budget. Oh, we're not going to cut the state pension. Nothing wrong with rebalancing in that way. But of course, what it means is that 5% you're looking for elsewhere suddenly becomes more than 10%.
And that's particularly the case because Reform have actually promised to increase health spending. Is that right?
They've pledged £17 billion for the NHS. Big increase in spending, yes. The problem there, I think, is what they're claiming you're going to get for your money. So currently waiting lists at very high levels following the pandemic, following the NHS's struggles since the pandemic. Reform are claiming they will eliminate those waiting lists entirely within 2 years. Now, that's never been achieved before. We've always had waiting lists. The health service is providing good health care free at the point of use. We're essentially rationing through some kind of waiting. So it's not clear that you can even achieve this within 2 years, even if you wanted to. It's certainly clear that if you were going to, it would require much, much, much more than £17 billion. So, for example, through the first decade of this century, through the 2000s, successive new Labour governments were increasing the NHS budget by inflation plus about 7% every year for a decade, in which waiting lists, yes, they fell, but they weren't eliminated.
So it sounds like big picture is some really big spending cuts. Another area that Reform wanted to bring down spending was in the working age welfare system, where they plan to have around £15 billion a year of savings. That compares to about £12 billion a year in the Conservative manifesto. What would it feel like to achieve that?
Well, at one level, it's important to remember that working age benefit spending's been rising really quite quickly recently, and that's forecast to continue rising over the next few years because of increasing numbers of people of working age who are in poor health qualifying for health-related benefits. So to some extent, taking out something like £15 billion would put the working age welfare bill, not far off what it is now, in the sense of you're stopping most of the saving would be stopping the growth. But that's not to say it would be easy to achieve. You certainly can't just say, what we're going to do is just get people off benefits and into work and save that sums. That's much easier said than done. If you really want to cut working age welfare, and when we've cut it in the past, it really involves saying, well, there's a set of people getting a certain amount of benefits. We're going to reduce the amount that they each get. That's much easier to do. You're just sending people essentially smaller payments. That can be done. The alternative way of getting people off benefits into work, much harder to pull off.
One area that Reform has planned to make back some more money is by changing the way that they approach interest payments on deposits held with the central bank. Can you try and explain to us what that actually means and whether it would really raise $35 billion?
So it's an incredibly complicated area, but essentially the Bank of England has borrowed money from the commercial banking sector in order to buy gilts, government loans. And on that money it's borrowed from the commercial sector, it's currently paying the rate of interest that it sets. The bank rate currently 5.25%. So there's quite a lot of interest being handed over from the Bank of England to these commercial banks in returns for those loans that they've made to it. Now, could we do something less generous there? Yes, we could. Other central banks often do pay a lower rate of interest on at least some of their reserves. What we can't do is save £35 billion a year on an ongoing basis as Reform claim. You wouldn't get that much money. And I think, yes, there's a case for a review here and thinking about what we might do. But certainly if we were to change policy in this area, I'd recommend it's done very, very carefully. It's not a risk-free area. The clear risk is you're taking money out of the banking sector, and they might respond by offering less generous interest rates on savers' deposits. They might respond by offering higher interest rates on the loans that they make available to people. So you need to be very careful in this area.
So that sounds like quite a detailed technical area of policymaking, probably not something where you can just walk in and hope to get $35 billion straight away. Speaking of trying to raise revenue, Helen, the Reform Party has actually set out quite a lot of tax reforms as well, in addition to these cuts in public service spending. And I think one principle that we at IFS would cheer, at least the principle of, is their desire to reform and simplify the tax system. They mentioned that Hong Kong's tax code is 500 pages and ours is 15,000 or something like that. Within the package that they've set out, are there any tax changes here that you'd actually welcome seeing?
Well, it's still at the top. It's a big package of tax cuts, although, as Carl noted, it still wouldn't have us, having dramatically lower taxes as a share of GDP overall. They want this £90 billion of tax cuts, and there's a big shopping list of things they would like to cut. So the ones that will jump out to people are the income tax changes, so increasing the point at which you would start paying income tax, increasing the point at which you start paying the higher rate of income tax. But there's also a near abolition of inheritance tax, big cuts of stamp duty, cuts to VAT on fuel, cuts to fuel duty, big cuts in corporation tax. So lots going on here. In one sense, it will be simpler because fewer people will be paying income tax, and therefore that would simplify the system. And some of these things could be part of a broader reform, but a lot of them are just political choices about who you want to pay tax. Just to pick a couple of examples on, kind of a good example and a bad example. I mean, stamp duty, as we said many times in this podcast now, is a truly awful tax. So taking opportunities to cut that would be good for all sorts of reasons. So, a welcome move. Whereas they've also said they want to cut VAT on fuel. So currently fuel already has a lower rate of VAT. It's taxed at 5% rather than the regular 20%. They want to get rid of that tax altogether. I think that's a move in the wrong direction. And it's a move in the wrong direction even if you want to scrap net zero and forget about that, because it effectively means we're already subsidising the use of energy relative to other things you can buy. So if you buy, a handbag or some clothes, you might be paying tax, but you'll pay less if you pay fuel. And this is now increasing that subsidy. So even if we're not talking about trying to penalise using energy, it's actually subsidising it relative to other stuff. And that's a move in the wrong direction. But yeah, a big package of tax cuts. I think worth pointing out that they've put the figure at 90 billion. we think it would be tens of billions of pounds more than that. So if you actually wanted to go ahead with all the measures they've written down, then I think you'd have to find a lot more money to do it. So more cuts, for example, of the type that Carl was setting out earlier, or you'd have to do less than you've set out here. But I don't think you can have both the scale of the tax cuts they're setting out here based on the scale of the spending cuts that we heard about earlier.
So even such a huge package of spending cuts and such a wide-ranging package of spending cuts, still not enough to afford the big package of tax cuts that Reform have set out. You can have that smaller state, but you probably can't have it at this price tag.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, and even on, actually, they make very optimistic assumptions about economic growth. I mean, assuming that economic growth would increase a lot, I think that would be very hard to see how that would happen. Even with that, I think you don't get this package adding up.
So the Reform Manifesto, that's a lot of big numbers and a really big change in what the state would do. Much lower taxes, much lower spending, and yet still those numbers not necessarily adding up. Let's move to a different party who have taken really the opposite approach to their manifesto. So the Green Party manifesto, which came out last week, set out plans to tax an awful lot more, borrow an awful lot more, and spend an awful lot more as well, looking for plans for a much bigger state. Helen, the plan is for £170 billion a year in tax rises. What would that mean in the context of the tax revenue that the UK takes from its economy?
So I think we could call this the podcast of big numbers, couldn't we? Because these are big even by kind of IFS standards of podcasts. So look, 170 billion of tax rises would be, a big chunky increase. It would take tax as share of national income to levels that we haven't seen in the UK historically. It wouldn't blow us out of the ballpark internationally. We'd be up and down the pack, I expect, with European countries, but a big increase nonetheless. If you look at where they want to get it from, then on the face of it, it looks at least at first like they're really targeting this towards higher earners. So they want to introduce a wealth tax for those with very high levels of wealth. They want to reform capital gains tax, increase national insurance contributions for those earning more than £50,000. So it sounds, in principle, like a package that is targeted more to the top. And those measures are targeted more to the top. And in fact, we've seen under the Conservatives for the last 14 years, taxes have gone up in a way that have been more skewed towards the top. So we're getting more from higher earners than we used to. But I think it's worth stepping back and saying, actually, the fuller set of measures wouldn't only hit people at the top. I think a couple maybe worth mentioning. One is pensions tax relief. So at the moment, when you put money into a pension, you get tax relief and you get taxed on the way out. They would like to limit that so that you only get 20% relief and not relief at your marginal rate. That won't just hit very wealthy people. I mean, you have some people like teachers and nurses who are making pension contributions that would feel that. So it'd be coming further down the income distribution. Much bigger picture, I think more importantly, they want to raise £90 billion from taxing carbon. That is a very large number. I think you could question whether you could do it. I think just one thing about these kinds of tax where you're trying to tax people to change behaviour, the more successful it is, the more people stop doing something, the less revenue you raise. So even if you could get large sums over time, I think you'd get less because people would stop consuming fossil fuels. But that's a tax that very clearly would affect all of us. You don't get to take £90 billion out of the economy by taxing fossil fuels and not have everybody be feeling that. So on the face of it, a package that's skewed towards the top, some of the measures definitely are. But if this is actually implemented, such a large tax on carbon would affect all of us. And clearly, I think it's probably their intention, lead to big change in the economy. It would lead to big change in, how we organise ourselves and what we consume.
So environmentally, that sounds probably quite desirable to aid the sort of transition towards net zero. Fiscally, that sounds incredibly risky to try and load that much of our tax base onto one element, one tax, one part of the economy. And when you were speaking just now about the skew towards higher income people, I wondered if that sounded a little bit risky as well, given the direction of travel that we've seen.
Yeah, so just unpacking that a little bit. I mean, is it environmentally desirable? Obviously, people take different views about how quickly you want to move to net zero. I think one thing that's definitely desirable in what the Green Party have said, and credit to them, is that they want to align taxes on different sources of energy. So at the moment, if you look at the effective tax rate on different forms of energy, whether it's done by a household, whether you're using gas or electricity, whether it's a business, the tax rates vary wildly. And there's no good reason for that. So it's making it more costly than it needs to be to get to net zero. So I think a very good case for aligning taxes across different types of energy use and making them consistent. Then we could debate how high the tax rate should be and how quickly you want to get it down, and think about things like, do you want a distributional package of measures to go alongside? Because some poor people would find, and middle earners would find it very hard to be facing this kind of taxes. So I think we could debate about the exact package of things like that. But yeah, 90 billion from this would be hard. I mean, it'd certainly be very difficult to fund a permanently bigger state this way. I think you'd need to be looking at, even if you got that money in the short run, I think that would be difficult. But if you've got it, what would you do in the medium run as that revenue runs out? In fact, as an aside, we kind of had that problem already in a smaller sense with fuel duty. We're currently taxing motoring fuels. We expect that to run out. We're going to need to do something to replace that revenue. And that we're talking about much smaller sums there. So a similar thing will be happening here. If you have a big tax, as it runs out, it gets risky. And you need to start planning for that sooner rather than later. And to cycle back to your point about the high earners, I mean, I think there's some risk there. And the risks are very depending on exactly which tax you have. But we said at the start this wouldn't make us completely unusual internationally. We would be unusual in how we got our tax. Imagine this was implemented. We would be unusual in how we were getting higher revenue. So most governments in Europe that get more revenue from us than us overall get more than we do relatively from average earners. They're not just relying on the very rich or on environmental taxes. So this would, be a bit unusual in that regard.
So another way of trying to get lots of tax revenue out of lots of very wealthy people is just to try and tax that wealth directly. You hear mixed things about this. Some people say, great, this is going to be a really wonderful way of improving social mobility and increasing equality of opportunity. Other people say that's going to be a practical nightmare to try and implement. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I think different people often mean different things when I talk about wealth taxes. I think it's worth distinguishing what we mean. So what the Green Party are proposing is like an annual wealth tax. So you measure the stock of wealth somebody has and every year you tax it. There is absolutely a big practical headache there. The government do not currently collect data on people's wealth. And while some wealth is very easy to measure, some wealth is very hard. So think of a private business. And if you're talking about people who've got over £10 million in assets, you're looking at people who've often got private businesses. If they're not traded on a stock market, it's actually very hard to know what your business is worth every year. So there would be a huge administrative practical headache in just getting this tax up off the ground and implementing it. Even if you could do it, because whether you want to do it, my view, without taking us into a podcast just about wealth taxes, is that we'd be much better off taxing the incomes that flow from wealth. So if you and I both have £1 billion in the bank, wouldn't that be nice? But you're a really great entrepreneur and you're just getting loads of returns and I'm actually just putting it in a nest egg for retirement. I think it makes sense to tax the capital gains or the incomes you get from that. And you would get a high tax rate because you're better at this stuff than I would. So I would absolutely reform how we tax the flows of income that come from wealth. Capital gains would be the big obvious one there. And I would do that, way before I got into wealth tax. My personal view is that wealth tax is the wrong way to go. Whereas the Green Party are proposing reforming capital gains tax. And I think if it's done properly, so not just increase the rates of our current capital gains tax, because there's problems with doing that. If they actually reformed it properly to change the tax base as well, then I think you could tax more of the flows from wealth as well.
And I think that becomes really important because nobody really expects that the Green Party is going to take government, but there might well be policies within this manifesto that whoever does take office might be looking to take advantage of, to steal, to think about ways of raising that bit of extra revenue. So you've talked about reforms to capital gains tax. Is there anything else in here that would be worth parties looking at?
Yeah, and of course it's always worth saying that some policies are just really distributional. People have different views on where they want to raise money from, so parties, and some of that is in here. And the places that are just economically good regardless of your distributional preferences are, as we already mentioned, aligning the taxes on different forms of energy. So regardless of whether you want to get to net zero quickly or slowly, why do we want to get it there more quickly on some energy forms and not other energy forms? So aligning the taxes now I think would be a good idea. Another one that I'm going to give a plug for is council tax. So we've said, council tax is now absurdly out of date, 33 years and counting on since it's been valued. I think the Green Party are the only party that are saying they would actually revalue it and get to grips with that. Certainly the main parties have ruled it out. So I think that is a system that's becoming unsustainable and needs to be looked at. So I'd say, take that one out of the Green Manifesto.
Great. Well, that's finally some practical future-oriented solutions coming out of IFS. Despite this, Carl, so Helen's talked us through £170 billion on the Green Zone costings of tax rises. Despite all of that, the Greens' plan would still leave debt rising as a share of national income. So how does the math on that add up? Where would all of that money go?
So on their own figures, they've got the £170 billion a year of revenue. They want to spend about £160 billion of that on day-to-day spending. So increases in spending on different public services. Health and social care gets a big slice. So does overseas aid, so does education. And then outside of public services, quite a lot for working age welfare. So, for example, to give one example, the 2-child limit would be ended. So big increase in day-to-day spending on public services, big increase in welfare spending. And I think it's worth saying there that unlike the other parties, at the start of this election campaign, we said, conspiracy of silence, the main parties ignoring the fact that the plans that Jeremy Hunt, the current Chancellor, set out in the March budget imply these big cuts to unprotected public services. Well, actually, the Greens, to be fair, do have an increase in spending for these other public services. So they have a strategy to deal with that, which is basically don't do the cuts, raise the money through tax revenue instead. So they don't have that gap in their plans, which we think that actually the Conservative Party, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats certainly do have in their manifesto plans. So day-to-day spending increases covered by tax rises. Why would they be borrowing more? It's because they want to do a big injection in capital spending. The vast majority of that is going on what they describe there as their green economic transformation. So on their own figures, about £90 billion a year of extra spending on capital, about 70 of which is on these green items to try and help bring about net zero more quickly than it otherwise would come about. Overall, that does leave them with more borrowing. On their own figures, they admit to this, a deficit that's about £80 billion a year higher by the end of the Parliament. Therefore, debt would still be rising as a share of national income. So the trade-off here essentially is you get a lot more investment in green capital spending. You get the transition to net zero more quickly, but you also get a bigger stock and a rising stock of government debt at the end of the next Parliament. That might be fine, but at some point we have to bring that down. You can't just keep having debt rising as a share of GDP into the longer term.
So I suppose the Green Party might say, we're going to do all of this investment, we're going to accelerate the transition to net zero, and that's going to get growth going. And so beyond the next Parliament, the denominator of that, the size of our economy, will be so much bigger that the debt won't matter as much. Are you sympathetic to that argument?
Well, I certainly think if you spend money on investment and you spend it well, you will almost certainly get some more sustainable growth in your economy. I think it's important to remember when you're looking at green investments, you're picking investments not on the basis of which investment will bring me the most economic growth. You're explicitly asking the question, what's going to help me get the transition to net zero? Now, I wouldn't say that doesn't mean you might not get some boost to growth, but you won't get as big a one because you're ruling out projects which might be very economically growth friendly, but they're not going to help you get to net zero quicker. So I wouldn't reject the idea that you might get a bit more growth from that. I think I'd also point out that some of the tax rises they're proposing, increased taxes on many higher earners, for example, might be a drag on growth. But even if it's net positive, I think with the kinds of size of borrowing they're doing, you'd still be seeing debt rise at the end of the coming Parliament. There's no plausible boost to growth that's going to be sustainable that would stop that from happening. I don't think the Green Party is trying to claim that this plan would pay for itself or that you'd have debt falling. I think what their argument more is that they put a higher priority on green investment than they do on getting debt down.
I think one thing that's remarkable about this manifesto is how much of an attempt they've made to prioritise pretty much everything, green investment, but also these areas of public services. So if the Green Party's plans were to go ahead and they did put that much into public services, where would that leave these unprotected departments that we're talking so much about?
Well, I think there's enough money in these plans on ballpark, it looks like there's enough money in these plans to avoid the need to find cuts to day-to-day spending on areas like prisons, justice, further education that we've identified. I think in practice, the Green Party might find some of the spending increases would be perhaps harder to make happen well as quickly as they hope. So some of the spending is on what we would describe as perhaps protected areas, big boost to health spending, for example. I don't think they'd probably get an extra £30 billion spent in year one of a Green government and see that spent well. I think probably they'd be wise to go about it more slowly to make sure the money did have a good effect. But on the unprotected stuff, I think they can pretty much avoid cuts here. So to that extent, they do have a full plan. But of course, that full plan is predicated on all of the tax rises that Helen spoke about going ahead and bringing in the money that the Green Party thinks.
So Helen's told us that the tax rises would push up the UK's tax revenues, but we would still look pretty unusual in international comparison in terms of where we're getting that money from. If these plans for public services did go ahead, does this make the UK just another high tax, high spend economy like Western Europe or Scandinavia?
Not quite. I mean, we would be a pretty high spender on health because there's a big increase in health spending. They also want to increase spending on foreign aid. I think by international comparisons, perhaps outside of Scandinavia, would be a pretty high spender on overseas aid as well. And in terms of investment spending, actually on green investment spending, I think we'd be a very high spender relative to most other countries. I don't think it would be the case that would be an average or a low level at all.
Well, there you have it. We have two very different visions for the future of the UK. On the reform side, we're going to see big tax cuts, big spending cuts. And on the green side, a plan to tax an awful lot more, borrow a lot more, and use that to fund quite a bit more spending. Carl, Helen, thank you both so much. And thank you to our audience for listening to this special episode of the IFS Zooms In. We'll be back later this week to look at the SNP and Plaid Cymru manifestos. In the meantime, you can find more of our work by visiting www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We'll see you next time.